I was filling out the night incident log when the fog reached the outer lights and stopped, like it was waiting for permission to move closer. My name came through the radio a second later, not spoken, just shaped in static the way voices sometimes almost form. And that's when I remembered the briefing I'd laughed off weeks earlier. They'd told me there were 11 strange rules I had to follow to survive night shifts on this rig. Rules no one ever justified and no one ever wrote down. I'd already broken one without realizing it, standing there staring into the fog instead of pretending it wasn't there. The log entry stayed unfinished, because something outside the glass was listening. The first time I realized how dangerous it was, the fog had slid past the starboard rail, moving deliberately against the wind, and I froze, remembering clearly Rule 1. Never acknowledge the fog if it moves against the wind. I forced myself to keep my head down, pretending to check gauges while the mist pooled around the crane supports, thick enough to blur edges but not so heavy that I couldn't move. My boots clinked against the steel grating, and the usual echo of movement was gone, leaving only the dense shimmer of fog hovering like it had intention. I told myself it was a shift in pressure, a trick of temperature and wind, but the feeling of being watched pressed against my chest as though the rule were alive. The deckhands had disappeared somewhere below, and the usual hum of the rig felt hollow, replaced by the slow crawl of fog across every surface I passed. I moved carefully, counting my steps out loud under my breath to distract myself, focusing on nothing but the maintenance panels that never needed my attention. The fog wrapped around ladders and railings, curling through gaps in the grating with a fluid patience that made my stomach churn. Every instinct begged me to look at it, to speak, to call someone down from the upper deck, to confirm I wasn't imagining it. But the fog didn't respond to confirmation, it only waited. I kept scanning the horizon, noting the lights of the distant platforms and blinking towers, letting them anchor me to reality, even as the fog clung to the edges of my vision like it was testing me. I realized quickly that moving slowly wasn't enough. Hesitation itself was dangerous. I reached the stairwell leading to the lower deck, and the fog had already begun curling down the support beams like smoke that refused to dissipate. My hands gripped the railing tighter than necessary, my knuckles whitening, and I reminded myself to keep my breathing even. The metallic taste of sea spray, mixed with diesel, filled my mouth as I descended, each step deliberate to avoid any sudden movement that might draw attention. The fog's density seemed to adjust to my pace, thickening when I slowed, thinning slightly when I forced myself to keep a consistent rhythm. I realized the mist didn't just move, it measured you, gauging hesitation and compliance with some silent intelligence. By the time I reached the lower deck, the temperature had dropped, subtly, imperceptibly, but enough that I noticed goosebumps spreading across my arms beneath my coveralls. I paused to log routine observations, recording pressure readings, wind shifts, and deck integrity, though my eyes kept flicking to the edges of the fog. It didn't make sense to me then, but I understood instinctively that acknowledging its movement was more than risky. It was participatory. I had to behave as if it was nothing, even though every nerve in my body told me it was watching. I tried to remember my orientation, tracing the ladders back to the upper deck in case I needed to retreat, but the fog made distances deceptive, a soft veil that distorted spatial awareness. At the far end of the deck, near the supply storage, the fog curled under the lights in a way that made the shadows stretch unnaturally long. I kept my head down, pretending to inspect containers and check for leaks, while my peripheral vision caught the subtle shifts in the mist. The rule had never explained what would happen if it touched you, only that you could not acknowledge it. I realized the ambiguity was deliberate. The rig had been designed to isolate individuals and test compliance without instruction. My hands fumbled over the locks on the storage doors, and I felt a prickle at the nape of my neck, like someone had brushed close behind me. No one was there, only fog. A low hum of the machinery beneath the deck vibrated through my boots, and I could almost feel the fog react, as if it were sensing the tension in my movements. I reminded myself again to keep calm, to stay methodical, moving from container to container without glancing at the mist. There was a subtle rhythm to the way it shifted, curling around obstacles, pausing at gaps, always advancing in increments that made me question my own perception. I tried to occupy my mind with log entries, small maintenance tasks, anything to feel useful, but the fog's presence expanded my anxiety, pushing it into a gnawing pressure behind my eyes. I realized that awareness itself might be the most dangerous thing. The lower stairwell that led to the engine room was partially shrouded, the fog pooling along the handrails and coiling around pipes with a strange patience. I could hear the low thrum of pumps and generators, but it seemed muted, softened as though the mist was absorbing sound. My feet felt heavier, dragging slightly as I descended, and I had to force my mind to treat the fog as background, a neutral environmental factor rather than a potential predator. Each step demanded concentration, not just for safety but for survival. I caught myself imagining shapes forming within the vapor, only to chastise myself for looking. A single glance could be the mistake that shifted the balance. By the time I reached the engine room door, the fog had begun creeping along the floor plates, thin and wavering but undeniably deliberate. I paused, brushing a bead of sweat from my forehead, and realized that I hadn't spoken aloud since leaving the upper deck. Silence was part of the rule as much as ignorance, an unspoken pact to deny the fog's significance. I pressed the door open slowly, careful not to disturb the mist beyond its edges, and the interior smelled of oil, metal, and something slightly damp that didn't belong. I forced myself to step through as though nothing unusual existed, maintaining my mechanical checklists and routine, because I understood fully that hesitation would invite attention. Inside the engine room, the fog seemed to follow, seeping through vents and under doors in a slow, intentional motion. I moved from panel to panel, recording readings, checking for irregularities, and trying to keep my pulse steady. Every flicker of a gauge made my stomach tighten. Every wavering light along the ceiling made my eyes dart instinctively toward the shifting mist. I tried to anchor myself by focusing on instruments and mechanical noises, pretending that the fog was merely condensation carried from outside. But the subtle displacement of air, the way it bent around machinery, suggested a presence with focus and intent. Even compliance felt like a test. For over an hour, I followed this routine, stepping lightly, keeping my hands busy with logs and instruments, letting the fog slide past without recognition. My mind began to map the patterns, noting the way it curved around corners, avoided the central catwalk, and pooled near open grates. I realized that the rule was not simply about survival, it was about obedience, a mental contract to ignore something that was very real. Anxiety twisted my thoughts as I moved through the deck, trying to remain methodical while my attention kept snapping toward subtle cues, a shadow at the edge, a condensation bead rolling up a pipe, the slight tremor in the floor. Compliance felt almost unnatural. Finally, I returned to the upper deck, retracing my steps with painstaking care, counting each railing post and light fixture. I logged every measurement, every environmental factor, even as my mind screamed at me to glance upward at the fog swirling lazily against the wind. I forced myself to treat it as nothing more than mist, because acknowledging it, even mentally, seemed like a dangerous surrender. I noticed with a quiet terror how the fog seemed thicker on the corners I had paused at, lingering as though it had noticed every hesitation. The rule didn't say what would happen if you faltered, only that survival required consistent denial. As dawn approached, the fog began to dissipate, sliding back into the dark horizon, but the sense of being watched lingered. I checked logs, recorded anomalies, and made sure every sensor read normal, though my eyes kept flicking toward the open deck, imagining the mist curling along the rails. I realized that Rule 1 had become more than instruction. It had become a lens through which I interpreted every subtle anomaly. I walked slowly toward the crew quarters, trying to relax my shoulders, telling myself the worst was over, yet every instinct warned that compliance alone didn't guarantee safety. The fog had retreated, but my awareness of it had grown permanent, a quiet weight in my chest. By the time I reached the main control room, exhaustion had started creeping into my shoulders, a dull weight that made my hands feel heavy on the panels. And I remembered Rule 2, always keep the lights on, even if it drains power. The fog had mostly retreated from the upper deck, but shadows clung stubbornly to corners, deep and wavering, and the thought of the lights going out filled me with an almost tangible panic. I checked the breakers, flipping switches deliberately, as if affirming the rule with every motion, while the fluorescent panels hummed weakly overhead, casting uneven glows across the steel catwalks. Even at full brightness, the edges of the room felt wrong, warped by shadows that shouldn't have existed, and I reminded myself that visibility here wasn't just convenience, it was survival. The monitors lining the control panel flickered with environmental readings, some of them outdated by seconds, others surprisingly precise, and I realized that keeping the lights on wasn't just about seeing the fog, it was about maintaining a sense of control, a fragile illusion that nothing could seep in unnoticed. I moved from switch to switch, testing circuits and checking redundancies, trying to ignore the low vibration underfoot that made every metal grate feel alive. My throat felt dry, and I kept swallowing, telling myself that focus on tasks would distract from the dread curling quietly in my chest. Every time a shadow stretched toward the walls, I reminded myself to not hesitate, to keep the lights on, and to keep moving. As the rig's generators hummed steadily, I began pacing the corridors, tapping consoles and inspecting emergency panels, each step measured and deliberate. Even though the fog was mostly gone, the darkness around doorways seemed deeper, as if the absence of light allowed something unseen to gather. I forced myself to step closer to corners where I had avoided looking before, ensuring every lamp was lit, every emergency beacon functional. The rule wasn't just about illumination, it was about presence. To leave even a fraction of the rig in darkness felt like giving space to something that shouldn't exist, something that might claim even the smallest unlit patch as its own. During a sweep of the storage decks, I noticed the dimming of a small light above a maintenance hatch, the flicker almost imperceptible, and panic began to ripple across my awareness. My fingers tightened around the ladder rails as I climbed toward it, and I thought of every cautionary tale I'd ever heard about power failures on isolated rigs. A crewman had once told me that darkness had a way of stretching minutes into hours, making it impossible to judge time or distance accurately, and now I understood why. The room felt smaller as I reached the top, shadows clinging to the corners, the weak glow of the failing light barely illuminating the panel I needed to reset. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it and continue, but I couldn't. Rule 2 demanded otherwise. I spent what felt like hours methodically moving from section to section, ensuring that even the smallest lamps burned steadily. It wasn't enough to simply switch on the lights. I had to confirm their stability, watch for subtle fluctuations that might hint at generator strain or wiring issues. Sweat pricked my forehead, not from heat, but from the tight knot of anxiety pressing against my ribs. A constant reminder that failure here wasn't just inconvenience, it was an invitation. Shadows recoiled slightly when confronted by the harsh white glow, retreating to corners and seams as I moved methodically through the passages. The act of keeping the lights on became ritualistic, a physical affirmation that I existed in control, even as uncertainty lurked just beyond illumination. When I reached the catwalk above the engine room, I paused to survey the rig in its entirety, lights casting harsh reflections off wet metal surfaces, stretching long and thin across the deck. The fog's retreat had left behind a subtle haze that caught in the beams, blurring edges and warping perspective. I adjusted the overhead fixtures, ensuring every angle was bathed in clarity, all while my mind nagged at the impossibility of truly seeing everything at once. Maintaining light wasn't comfort here. It was a contract with the unseen rules of the rig. Each shadow I banished was a small reassurance, and yet the deeper my inspection went, the more aware I became that compliance alone did not guarantee safety. The rig's automated systems offered some relief, but I checked manually anyway, moving along catwalks and stairwells, confirming that emergency lamps were functioning and that the central circuit held steady. I imagined the fog returning, now that night was fading, and the wind had shifted unpredictably, and the thought made my fingers tighten around the railing. Each bulb and lead I verified became a statement. I was present, I was alert, and I obeyed the rule. The monotony of the task began to weigh heavily, but I refused to let fatigue dictate inattention. To fail even momentarily felt as though I would invite the darkness itself into corners I could not reach. Near the communication hub, I paused to record readings and double-check logs, glancing at every illuminated surface, scanning the shadows for discrepancies. Even when the fog was gone, the residual moisture clung to walls and pipes, distorting light and creating patterns that teased my eyes into seeing movement. I reminded myself that keeping the lights on wasn't reassurance for me. It was a defensive measure against forces I didn't understand. Every panel I checked, every emergency lamp I flicked to life, reinforced my presence, creating a grid of control in a place where control was otherwise an illusion. The rule was simple, but adherence required vigilance, patience, and a constant quiet fear that the fog or something else could return at any moment. Hours passed in this loop of verification and inspection, and I began to notice how exhaustion crept into subtle errors, hesitated flips of switches, skipped sections, eyes strained to the distorted shadows at the edges of my vision. I clenched my jaw, forcing each motion to be deliberate, a tactile mantra against mental drift. The rig's corridors were claustrophobic under the harsh glare of lights, every reflection creating doubles and triples of machinery that played tricks on my perception. It wasn't enough to simply comply. I had to internalize vigilance, let the act of keeping lights on become instinctive, a reflex that could override fear even as it pressed against me. Shadows receded marginally with each careful sweep, but the sense of being watched never fully abated. At the end of the night shift, as the first pale light of dawn threatened the horizon, I performed a final sweep, checking every lamp, panel, and emergency system one more time. The fog had faded completely from the deck, leaving only the lingering unease in the corners, subtle and persistent, a reminder that night could return at any moment. I noted inconsistencies in power draw, minor fluctuations that I knew would stabilize once the generators fully engaged, yet my mind lingered on the thought of lights failing. Compliance with Rule 2 had kept me busy, focused and alive, but it also reinforced an awareness that the rule existed not as protection alone, but as a tether to something beyond comprehension, something patient and observing in the periphery. I had almost stepped toward the gangway when the memory hit me, clear and sudden. Rule 3. Never leave the deck without checking all hatches are sealed. The fog had returned in thin curls, creeping along the edges of open catwalks, teasing at my peripheral vision, like it had curiosity for a living thing. I paused, a tightening in my chest, realizing that leaving a hatch unsecured wasn't just about safety. It was about preventing something I didn't fully understand from slipping inside. My boots clicked against the metal grating as I retraced my steps, fingers brushing over each latch to confirm the seal, but the act felt almost performative, like ritual, as though acknowledging it too casually would betray some unseen observer. Even the faintest gust of wind, through a barely latched hatch, felt like an invitation for the fog to cross the threshold, and the thought made my heart accelerate. The storage hatch nearest the crane supports was the first I inspected, its metal edges slick with condensation. I knelt and ran a hand along the latch, pressing and twisting until it clicked into place, the sound loud in the quiet hum of the rig. Each hatch became a small anchor, a tactile reassurance that some control still existed amid the creeping fog. I noticed how the mist pooled near the hinges, subtle and deliberate, as if it was observing my compliance with Rule 3, though I reminded myself that I couldn't afford imagination to dictate reality. My mind kept racing, cataloging hatches I had opened for inspection earlier, tracing each route and airflow, trying to convince myself that attention and diligence alone were enough to hold the rig together. Moving toward the aft section, I had to step over coils of cable and support beams, careful not to let my movements seem hesitant or alarmed. The fog brushed against the base of the hatches, curling and spinning with a near sentience that made my skin crawl. I ran a gloved hand over the metal, feeling the slickness, the cold and the subtle vibration from engines beneath my feet, and I realized that the smallest lapse could render the rule meaningless. Each hatch was more than a door. It was a barrier, a line of defense, and my awareness of that barrier became almost obsessive. The fog reacted slightly to my presence, drawing into corners I had left unchecked, a soft whisper of movement I couldn't identify, but felt pressing at my awareness. I paused midway along the deck to note pressure readings and air currents, scribbling in my log while keeping one eye on the fog gathering near the side railing. The rule had never been fully explained, but the consequences of ignoring it were clear from crew stories, hushed and fragmented. The thought of opening a hatch and walking away while the mist seeped in made me shiver, and I imagined what might slip through if I let carelessness take hold. Each check became more meticulous, every hinge and latch scrutinized, every seal pressed until I could be sure it was tight. The fog clung to edges, wavering as though evaluating my thoroughness, and I realized that adherence to the rule demanded not only action, but constant awareness. Near the center deck, I found myself inspecting hatches I had almost forgotten existed, tucked under machinery or along narrow walkways. The fog pooled thicker here, lingering around pipes and posts, and I felt a subtle pressure in my chest, like it wanted to test my focus. My hands worked mechanically, pressing, twisting, listening for clicks, while my mind cataloged the positions and alignment of each barrier. I couldn't shake the sense that some subtle force was gauging compliance, and the line between careful attention and obsession blurred. Leaving a hatch unsecured wasn't merely careless, it was an invitation to be measured, judged, and possibly taken advantage of by the unknown elements waiting outside the safety of steel walls. By the time I reached the forward hatch, leading to the observation deck, my back ached and my shoulders burned from the constant motion. The fog had thinned here, curling gently around the railings like a living ribbon, teasing at the edges of my vision. I pressed the latch firmly into place, testing the seal with deliberate force, and felt the tension in my fingers release only slightly when it held. Each successful closure brought a temporary sense of control, but I was aware that the rule wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. One slip, one partially latched door, could undo hours of careful attention, allowing the fog or something worse to infiltrate the rig. Moving down the port side, I double-checked hatches near storage lockers, pausing occasionally to listen to the subtle shifts in fog density outside. The mist seemed aware of my movements, curling and recoiling subtly, and I felt an almost tangible resistance in the air, like walking through water that refused to be ignored. Every latch I secured was a small triumph, a quiet reassurance against the pervasive uncertainty that had grown since Rule 2. The routine became hypnotic: inspect, press, twist, confirm. I noted tiny discrepancies in the metal's temperature, the way condensation pooled differently depending on airflow, and realized that adherence to the rule required constant adaptation and attention. Along the starboard railing, near the crane control hatches, the fog thickened momentarily, brushing under the doors and pooling against the walls. I leaned over, pressing each hatch firmly, listening for the faint click and testing the seal by pushing lightly. Even with diligence, the unease never left. I could feel the fog pressing near my ankles, curling around supports, stretching toward me without breaking, almost expectant. The rule demanded compliance, but it also demanded vigilance beyond what I had ever experienced. I tried to convince myself that thoroughness and patience were enough, but the fog's quiet persistence whispered otherwise, suggesting that the simple act of closing hatches might not be enough. Near the aftmost hatches, I moved carefully, aware that fatigue was sharpening my perception of every imperfection. The fog swirled slightly higher here, along the deck grates, brushing my boots with damp fingers that seemed alive. Each latch I secured felt like a small assertion of control, yet the subtle pressure in the air reminded me that my efforts were temporary at best. I noted the alignment, the seal, the vibration of the metal beneath my hands, treating each hatch as a barrier not just to weather, but to something patient and calculating. The repetition began to weigh heavily, yet I understood instinctively that the rule was absolute. Even a single oversight could render compliance meaningless. As I worked my way forward one final time, inspecting smaller access hatches beneath equipment, I realized that the fog had retreated slightly, curling along the edges but thinning in density. My hands ached, my back protested, and my mind felt frayed at the edges, yet I maintained the careful method of pressing, twisting, confirming, never leaving a hatch unsecured. The rule demanded attention to detail at all times, and I knew instinctively that the moment I allowed fatigue or distraction to guide me, I would have invited disaster. Each hatch, once sealed, became a temporary relief, a minor victory against the persistent uncertainty that the fog embodied. The act of securing the deck was a ritual now, as much psychological as practical, anchoring me in a fragile sense of security. By the time I returned to the control room, I had inspected every hatch on the deck at least twice, methodically noting alignment, seal integrity, and the way condensation gathered around each edge. The fog lingered faintly, curling along corners and vents, but the immediate tension eased slightly with the certainty that I had followed Rule 3. Even so, a faint unease clung to me, an awareness that compliance alone did not guarantee safety. The deck was secure, for now, and the fog had not found its way in, but I understood deeply that vigilance was continuous. Leaving hatches unchecked was unthinkable, a risk I could not allow, because the fog had a memory, and it noticed everything. I noticed it first, as a subtle shift near the supply crane, a vibration too light for anyone else to detect. And my mind immediately recalled Rule 4. Always report unusual movements immediately, even if it seems trivial. The fog had returned in thin veils along the deck, brushing against railings and twisting under stairwells, and even the smallest displacement felt amplified in the quiet hum of the generators. I paused, leaning over the railing, feeling the vibration pulse through the metal under my palms, and I knew that ignoring it could mean more than a malfunction. It could be the first sign of something that wasn't mechanical. My fingers itched to tap out a report, to call someone down to confirm what I was feeling. But instinct told me to observe first, and observation alone was a tightrope. Moving closer, I followed the subtle undulations across the deck, tracing them from one support beam to the next, careful not to let my boots produce extra noise that might obscure the pattern. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted by the thought that even the smallest oversight might be noticed by something beyond comprehension. I logged details in my mind, describing every nuance, every hesitation in the motion, while the fog clung lightly to the edges of my vision, a silent witness. The rule demanded immediacy, yet acting too quickly without understanding could provoke consequences I couldn't predict. The line between careful observation and decisive reporting blurred, and I realized that compliance required a balance of courage and prudence. As I crouched near the crane's base, the vibrations pulsed again, irregularly this time, and I noted how the metal grating beneath my hands shivered under the pressure. I forced myself to write quick observations in the handheld log, using shorthand and numbers, trying to remain methodical while anxiety pushed at the edges of my focus. The fog swirled close enough to brush my sleeves, and I had to remind myself that movement itself could be deceptive in this environment, a subtle trick of reflection and shadow. Reporting wasn't just protocol, it was a mental exercise to ensure that every minor anomaly was acknowledged, every irregularity treated as potentially significant. Even a pause to consider the context could be costly. I traced the vibrations along the deck, noticing how they shifted in frequency and intensity with the flow of wind, though the fog's presence made measurement unreliable. My hands pressed against panels and railings, feeling for subtle quivers, while my eyes darted across shadows, searching for origin points. The sensation of being observed grew stronger, pressing from the corners, the edges, and even the faint shimmer of fog that clung just above the metal. Each time I hesitated, the rule replayed in my mind, urging immediate reporting. But the act of reporting here was not straightforward. It required precision, clarity, and the mental fortitude to admit that something unseen was influencing the rig. Descending toward the lower deck, I felt the vibrations intensify subtly, almost as if the fog itself was guiding their rhythm. My boots clanged lightly on grates, and I had to concentrate to isolate what was mechanical and what wasn't. I recorded every nuance mentally, readying myself to transmit an anomaly report, yet uncertainty gnawed at me. The fog brushed against pipes and vents, curling with deliberate patience, and I realized that the immediacy demanded by the rule wasn't merely about protocol, it was about demonstrating awareness, making my presence known to the unseen observers. Hesitation could allow the subtle irregularity to grow into something unmanageable. At the edge of the storage area, near the aft railing, the vibrations shifted to an almost organic rhythm, uneven but persistent, and the fog seemed to follow along the perimeter, thickening slightly where metal met air. I pressed my hands against the nearest hatch for balance, noting every minuscule quiver, and felt the urge to call in someone from the control room immediately. The rule demanded urgency, yet the practicalities of distance and isolation complicated the action. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, imagining what might happen if a minor anomaly went unreported, or if I misinterpreted a benign shift for something malignant. The fog seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, amplifying the tension. Each step across the deck became a test of attention, a rehearsal of precision, as I monitored every flicker of lights, every sway of cables, every subtle hint that something was off. Reporting wasn't just about communication, it was about survival, a ritual of acknowledgement that confirmed not only the anomaly, but my own presence in a space that could easily erase awareness. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, realizing that vigilance was unending, and that the fog measured attention as much as compliance. Every minor displacement, every tremor, demanded recognition, and yet the act of reporting carried risk in itself, as though drawing attention could invite consequences. Near the engine room entrance, the vibration pattern shifted again, and I paused, watching the fog swirl just above deck, brushing along the edges of metal. I noted how subtle the movement was, the way it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less careful, and I understood that the rule's insistence on immediacy wasn't merely protocol, it was protection against my own inattention. I prepared to transmit a report, but hesitated, aware that even this act of acknowledgement could change what was observing me. The air felt heavier, denser, as if compressed by awareness, and every instinct told me that the smallest delay could escalate consequences beyond mechanical failure. I walked the length of the lower deck systematically, tapping panels, checking alignment of machinery, and tracing vibrations, noting discrepancies in readings with careful mental records. The fog clung faintly, curling along railings and corners, and I imagined it testing my consistency, observing how diligently I followed the rule. Reporting anomalies required not only speed but clarity, precision, and courage, because misinterpretation could be as dangerous as inaction. Every minor tremor felt amplified in significance, a silent metric of attention, a subtle reminder that the fog, and whatever else lingered beyond comprehension, was patient and calculating. As dawn approached, I completed a final sweep of all affected areas, noting subtle changes in vibration and airflow, confirming stability in all mechanical systems, and preparing to transmit my report to the control room. The fog had thinned, but the lingering presence in corners and under railings reminded me that observation alone was insufficient. Compliance with Rule 4 had kept me meticulous, aware and alive, yet I understood that immediacy didn't guarantee safety. It only offered the chance to respond. Every anomaly noted, every subtle movement recorded, was a small assertion of control in a space defined by uncertainty, vigilance, and an unrelenting sense of being measured. It was during the early hours of the second night, that I noticed the first chill creeping across the starboard catwalk and immediately remembered Rule 5. Never ignore the subtle temperature shifts on deck. They indicate more than weather. The fog had begun curling in slow spirals around railings, brushing along metal edges like it was tasting the surfaces. My skin prickled where the cold had settled, a biting awareness that wasn't caused by wind alone, and I realized that each small change in temperature carried a message. I paused, pressing my gloved hands against the railing, letting the chill register fully before moving, because acknowledging it too casually might be as dangerous as ignoring it entirely. The deck beneath me felt unnervingly alive, responding subtly to the pressure of the air, and perhaps to me. I began pacing slowly, noting differences in temperature as I crossed from one end of the deck to the other. The fog thickened slightly at the aft, pooling around stairwells and machinery, and I shivered involuntarily, aware that this was more than a natural fluctuation. My hands rubbed along the railings to judge warmth, scanning surfaces for the slightest shift, while the fog drifted lazily around my feet. The lights overhead cast pale glows across wet metal, exaggerating shadows that twisted in unnatural ways. Each step became a careful calculation, an acknowledgement that the temperature wasn't just cold air. It was an indicator of something beyond comprehension, something patient and watchful. Compliance with the rule demanded not only awareness but anticipation, recognizing changes before they became dangerous. The subtle shift intensified near the crane controls, a wave of chill moving against the deck's normal airflow, and I hunched slightly to conserve body heat while observing patterns. My breath fogged in front of my face as I crouched near a hatch, running gloved fingers along edges to detect the slightest condensation differential. The fog pressed close to the deck's surfaces, swirling around corners and pooling beneath panels, and I noticed that temperature changes aligned eerily with these movements. The awareness that the environment itself was responsive made each motion deliberate, measured, cautious. Ignoring this subtlety had consequences, and I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders like the chill that hadn't yet lifted. Walking toward the aft storage area, the air seemed to shift again, warmer in some patches and colder in others, the pattern too irregular to attribute to natural currents. I placed my palm on metal surfaces, trying to discern the subtle gradient of heat and cold, but the fog's proximity seemed to distort perception. Every instinct screamed to report or respond, but I knew the danger was in hasty action. This rule was about observation, patience, and interpretation. The air felt heavier near stairwells, as if it was concentrating around openings and seams, and my mind raced to map these anomalies in real time. Each degree difference, each micro shift in temperature, demanded attention and acknowledgement, an invisible thread linking observation to survival. Near the center deck, I paused to note subtle currents, feeling how the fog moved differently over warmer metal surfaces compared to colder sections. My eyes flicked to shadows curling under hatches, faint but distinct in the early light, and I felt the distinct prickling of apprehension along my spine. I ran my hand along the deck to detect subtle warmth, noting where frost formed and where it receded, mentally cataloging the inconsistencies. The rule's importance became terrifyingly clear. Each subtle change was an indicator of risk, a signpost for vigilance. Ignoring even minor variations in temperature might invite disaster, and the thought that these shifts could be influenced by more than the natural environment weighed heavily on me. I moved along the port catwalk, noticing that some sections of the deck retained heat while others were icy beneath my boots. The fog shifted in response, curling against warmer patches and hovering near colder areas, almost as though the mist were following patterns I couldn't fully interpret. My breath came unevenly, and I adjusted my jacket collar, trying to prevent shivering from clouding my perception. Each subtle fluctuation became a puzzle, a coded warning that required analysis and compliance. The act of walking, observing, noting, and cataloging became a ritual, a constant reinforcement of vigilance, because the temperature shifts weren't random, they were deliberate, responsive, and potentially dangerous. By the time I reached the forward observation deck, the cold had intensified in patches along the railing, and the fog thickened, curling around metal posts like it had its own weight. I crouched near a hatch, placing my hands on both sides of the metal and letting my fingers feel for the subtlest gradients. The difference between slightly warmer and slightly colder surfaces became a signal I had to interpret correctly. Misjudging it could mean ignoring a warning. My mind raced to understand why certain areas were colder or warmer, aware that the fog seemed to amplify these shifts as I paused to measure. Every step forward demanded heightened awareness, deliberate observation, and careful consideration of what the environment was communicating. Near the engine room, the air felt distinctly heavier, colder, and damp, the fog thickening around vents and support beams. I ran my gloved hand along railings and machinery, detecting the slightest variations in temperature, noting which areas felt unnaturally warm or cold. Each fluctuation seemed tied to the fog's position, reinforcing the eerie connection between physical changes and unseen presence. Compliance with the rule became less about personal comfort and more about survival, an acknowledgement that the environment itself carried instructions. Misinterpretation, hesitation, or ignorance could have catastrophic results, and I understood that meticulous attention to every subtle temperature shift was a necessity. Moving aft along the storage decks, I continued my slow survey, scanning every surface and noting the cold spots in warmer areas, correlating them with fog density and airflow. The mist lingered in corners, curling around posts and edges, emphasizing the most subtle gradients of cold and warmth. I noted how the metal beneath my fingertips responded differently, depending on location, orientation, and exposure to the fog, and I realized that my senses had to operate with near-perfect accuracy. Fatigue threatened to dull my awareness, but I forced every movement to remain deliberate, measured, and precise. Observing, acknowledging, and interpreting the temperature shifts had become both a physical and psychological task. By the time I returned toward the middeck, the fog had begun to thin slightly, yet the cold pockets persisted in irregular patterns. I continued my methodical sweep, pressing palms and fingers along edges, cataloging every fluctuation, every subtle wave of chill or warmth. The rule demanded constant vigilance. There was no margin for oversight. Each observation reinforced the importance of compliance, awareness, and patience, and I felt the heavy pressure of responsibility for understanding the environment correctly. The fog and temperature shifts acted as a subtle test, an unseen observer measuring my perception, my attention, and my adherence to Rule 5. Every moment of observation was both a survival exercise and an acknowledgement of forces beyond comprehension. It began as a faint metallic clang near the aft storage, subtle and irregular, and I immediately recalled Rule 6. Never trust sounds that seem too distant or delayed. My pulse jumped, though nothing moved in the fog curling along the deck. The noise echoed inconsistently, sometimes quicker, sometimes lagging, as if reality itself had slipped a fraction. I froze, listening carefully, aware that instinct alone wasn't reliable, that the rule demanded scrutiny and patience. Each vibration of sound against metal seemed warped, misleading, as though the deck beneath me was communicating in riddles. I shifted slightly, careful not to startle what might be observing, and realized how the fog distorted even simple noises into something that demanded interpretation. I moved cautiously toward the crane, each step measured, focusing on the subtle variations of sound in the empty air. The fog swirled along the support beams, twisting and pooling near corners, amplifying or muffling, each echo unpredictably. I tapped lightly on railings, comparing the resulting noises to those I heard naturally, training my ears to detect the irregularities. The rule was clear: any sound that lagged, came too late, or seemed oddly distant could not be trusted. It was a matter of survival, but obeying it required constant conscious awareness. The hum of the rig, the hiss of steam vents, and the distant groan of metal became a landscape of caution, each variation potentially signaling something beyond the obvious. Near the lower deck, I crouched by a hatch to listen, letting the vibrations run through the soles of my boots. The fog brushed against railings and piping, occasionally curling into the space beneath the hatch, as if testing my attentiveness. Every distant echo carried weight, and I noted how a single delayed clang could unbalance perception entirely. I tapped lightly on the grating, comparing sounds, forcing my mind to adjust for anomalies, and realized that the rig itself had become a symphony of deceptive signals. Compliance with Rule 6 required patience, attention to minute differences, and a willingness to treat even the most innocuous noises as potentially hazardous. Misjudgment here could be catastrophic. Crossing toward the engine room, the echoes changed subtly with each movement I made, and I felt the fog's presence amplifying certain vibrations. A distant thud came after what should have been a near-synchronous echo, and I froze, letting my mind map the discrepancy. My fingers gripped the railings tightly, tracing vibrations through metal to understand their origin. The fog seemed to swirl in response, accentuating the sense of dislocation. I realized then that obeying Rule 6 was as much about resisting instinct as it was about sensing danger. My mind wanted to trust what my ears reported, but the rule demanded skepticism. Every step, every tap, became a test of perception and composure. I crouched near the central deck panel, listening to the subtle hisses of compressed air and faint creaks of metal, comparing them against delayed echoes from distant machinery. The fog hovered near stairwells and support beams, shifting as though drawn to each sound. Each delayed note caused a shiver in my spine, a reminder that auditory perception could betray both body and mind. The rule wasn't simply about staying alert, it was a directive to constantly question reality itself. Even a familiar clank became suspect, a potential harbinger of something lurking beyond the visible edge of fog. I recorded mental notes with every observation, cataloging timing, pitch, and intensity, treating them as critical data for survival. The deck lights cast long reflections across wet metal surfaces, distorting perception, and each subtle echo was stretched by the uneven surfaces and lingering fog. I moved systematically, tapping metal supports, comparing sounds, triangulating possible sources, and always considering the delay. The rule pressed upon me like a mantra: never trust the timing of sound alone. I began to anticipate discrepancies, imagining how the fog or unseen forces could warp vibrations, how a delayed footstep or clang could lure me into error. Awareness became both a shield and a burden, each misjudged echo threatening to erode the fragile confidence I clung to on the deck. Near the aft railing, a metallic scrape sounded faintly from below, delayed by what felt like several heartbeats. I froze completely, listening, letting the sound wash over me before even moving, and my mind raced to determine whether it was machinery, fatigue-induced hallucination, or something else entirely. The fog swirled near the deck edge, curling around pipes and hatch covers, and I realized how much my own breathing could distort perception. Each delayed or distant sound demanded skepticism, and I moved with deliberate caution, ensuring that instinct didn't betray compliance with the rule. Survival hinged on meticulous interpretation, where doubt was as essential as certainty. By the time I reached the forward observation deck, the fog had thickened, pressing against edges of railing posts and stairwells, twisting in near-sentient ways. I crouched near a hatch, tapping lightly to test reverberation, while listening for echoes that lagged unnaturally. My mind cataloged patterns, comparing sounds, their delays and timing inconsistencies. Each subtle anomaly seemed to resonate with some hidden intelligence, as if the fog itself measured compliance. Awareness of Rule 6 became instinctual, but exhausting, and I realized that each delayed sound carried a dual threat, both physical and psychological, a constant test of vigilance and composure. Crossing back along the central deck, I felt the fog press lightly against my boots, curling along grates and corners, making each echo feel distorted. A faint scraping came again, distant and delayed, and I forced myself to ignore initial instinct, waiting for confirmation through multiple sensory channels. Each tap, each observation, became part of a careful routine, measuring reality against expectation. Rule 6 was relentless, demanding not only attention, but patience and humility before the unpredictability of the rig in the fog. It became clear that trusting instinct could be lethal, and I walked slowly, deliberately, knowing each sound could test my survival. Near the engine room, the fog was thick and curling around metal supports like it was alive, distorting sound further. The subtle creaks and vibrations became nearly impossible to interpret, and yet I continued my methodical movement, cataloging every anomaly, measuring distance, and timing each echo against expectation. Compliance with the rule demanded constant vigilance, as well as restraint from reaction. The fog's presence amplified uncertainty, each delayed noise a potential hazard, each irregular echo a warning. I reminded myself with each cautious step that auditory deception was real here, and that survival required the discipline to wait, measure, and interpret, not simply respond. By the final sweep along the upper deck, the fog had begun to thin in patches, but the subtle vibrations of delayed sounds remained, echoing across the steel and metal grates. I crouched, listened, tapped lightly, and mapped each echo, every faint anomaly cataloged in my mind. Obedience to Rule 6 was exhausting but necessary, as even a single misjudgment could render hours of careful vigilance meaningless. The fog seemed to curl at the edges of perception, reminding me of its patience and persistence. Even as I returned to the control room, my attention remained tuned to the smallest possible discrepancies, knowing the next delayed sound could appear anywhere, at any moment, testing both nerve and perception. I hesitated near the port railing, as the fog rolled in thicker than before, curling along the deck like it had weight and intent. And I immediately recalled Rule 7. Never move alone near the fog's edge, no matter how safe it feels. The wind was shifting erratically, tugging at loose cables, and making the deck beneath me slick with condensation. My boots pressed against metal grates, each step cautious, deliberate, aware that the slightest misstep could allow the fog, or whatever lurked within it, to reach me unnoticed. I looked around, noting the empty decks, wishing a crewman had accompanied me, but the solitude was absolute, pressing in like a living presence. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet I had to continue, because inspection could not wait, and hesitation felt dangerous. As I edged closer to the aft crane, the fog curled and shifted unpredictably, brushing near railings and stairwells, creating pockets of shadow that seemed to move independently. I forced myself to take measured steps, imagining another person beside me, a silent anchor against the disorienting pull of mist. The rule had always been about presence, a deterrent against misjudging distance, or being unaware of what lurked in low visibility. I pressed my hand along the railing, checking for irregularities, and felt the subtle vibration of metal beneath the fog. It was unnerving how even the smallest isolated section of deck could seem alive when approached alone, each twist of the mist amplifying the risk. Near the central deck, the fog thickened, pressing against pipes and machinery in curling fingers. I slowed my pace, aware that alone, every misstep could become fatal. My eyes darted constantly, scanning shadows, noting differences in density, temperature, and subtle motion that might hint at something unseen. The deck's wet surfaces reflected light poorly, creating illusions of extra stairways, railings, or machinery that weren't there. The rule's weight became a physical pressure. Movement alone meant heightened vulnerability, heightened perception, and a constant tension between progress and safety. I adjusted my stance with each step, imagining unseen eyes watching, and reminded myself why compliance demanded never approaching the fog unaccompanied. I crouched near a hatch to inspect it, careful to maintain balance on the slick metal, while the fog swirled unnaturally close to the deck's edge. Alone, the rule felt critical. No sound, no movement, no anomaly could be ignored. I pressed the latch with deliberate care, noticing how the fog seemed to gather along edges of panels, accentuating every corner. The isolation amplified every sensation: the scraping of my gloves, the faint vibration of the deck beneath my boots, even the soft whistle of the wind through open vents. Each detail reminded me that proximity to the fog demanded heightened awareness, and solitude exponentially increased the risk. Compliance wasn't optional, it was survival, a tether to reality in a space that resisted comprehension. As I moved aft, the fog thickened further, curling around stairwells and support beams like a living, restless thing. The distant hum of the generators felt muted, absorbed by the dense air, and every echo of metal or footstep seemed amplified in irregular ways. The rule's insistence on accompaniment was clear. Alone, disorientation could set in within seconds, and the fog could exploit it. My mind raced to anticipate movement, to calculate distances, to avoid misjudging the deck. I held each step deliberately, scanning not just what I could see, but what could lurk just beyond vision. The fog was patient, and I had to respect its presence with cautious compliance. Near the starboard railing, a sudden swirl of fog wrapped partially around a stairwell, shifting unpredictably, and I froze to evaluate. My gloves pressed against the railing for stability, and I imagined what could happen if I weren't alone. Someone else could anchor me against the deceptive movement. Someone could call attention to subtle shifts I might miss. The deck seemed unnaturally wide and narrow at the same time, a warped space created by the thickening mist. Rule 7 reminded me that isolation in this environment amplified danger, and I had to treat each step as if it might be my last. Awareness of surroundings, body position, and the fog's subtle tendencies became a simultaneous puzzle and survival tactic. I moved slowly toward the aft storage area, noting each shadow the fog created along edges and under beams. The swirling mist obscured the deck's boundaries, making it impossible to gauge depth or distance reliably. Alone, every misstep could become fatal. The rule's importance was almost visceral. I pressed my hands along railings, tested surfaces with careful taps of my boots, and adjusted pace constantly to avoid tripping or slipping. The fog seemed to react to my motion, curling closer to the deck in some areas, thinning in others, like it was testing my attention. Compliance with Rule 7 demanded vigilance, patience, and a steady rhythm of observation, a choreography I had to maintain carefully to survive. At the central crane, the fog swirled aggressively, and I had to crouch slightly to maintain balance. The deck felt alive beneath me, vibrating subtly with wind and machinery, but the fog's curling patterns suggested intelligence beyond natural phenomena. I reminded myself that moving alone here was precisely why Rule 7 existed. Even a simple task could become lethal if misjudged in isolation. I tapped lightly on metal surfaces, feeling for irregularities, and noted subtle changes in airflow that could betray hidden pockets of fog density. Solitude made every minor detail more consequential. One misstep, one overlooked anomaly, could tip the balance, and I understood that vigilance was the only shield against uncertainty. By the time I reached the forward observation deck, the fog had shifted again, forming thick curtains along the railings and stairways. I crouched near a hatch, testing it carefully, feeling the fog swirl along its edges. The rule demanded accompaniment, but no one was there. I was entirely alone. Each step was calculated, each movement deliberate, each breath measured against the rising tension. The fog's presence was palpable, pressing close but not yet touching, observing, evaluating, patient. Compliance with Rule 7 wasn't just protocol, it was an anchor to sanity, a way to maintain orientation, awareness, and survival when everything else on the rig seemed intent on disorienting and isolating me. Crossing back along the starboard deck, the fog thickened in patches, swirling unpredictably around stairwells, hatches, and structural supports. My boots made careful contact with the wet metal grates, and every subtle vibration resonated through my legs, reminding me of the instability of my surroundings. Rule 7 dictated caution, a methodical progression, and constant acknowledgement of my isolation. I had to maintain mental focus, as if my life depended on every calculated step, because it did. The fog's unpredictable movement, curling along the edges of the deck, reinforced the importance of never approaching alone. Compliance was survival, observation was protection, and solitude became a palpable presence pressing against my awareness. By the time I returned near the central deck, the fog had receded slightly but left lingering pockets along railings and support beams. I noted each change, each shift, each swirl, careful not to misjudge distance or curvature, constantly aware of my solitary position. The rule had become a mantra, a safeguard against the subtle manipulation of perception, and I understood how easily isolation could lead to disaster. Every tap of my boots, every pressure of my gloves, every step measured was a demonstration of compliance. The fog remained patient, persistent, and unpredictable, and I understood fully that my vigilance and adherence to Rule 7 were the only things keeping me oriented, safe and alive on the shifting, curling deck. The first moment I truly grasped Rule 8. Never underestimate the fog's density. It can conceal more than it reveals, was when I rounded the starboard railing, and the mist seemed to thicken instantly, swallowing the deck in a gauzy haze. My boots made careful contact with wet metal, but the swirling fog distorted distances, creating phantom railings and shadows where none existed. I paused, letting my eyes adjust, realizing that what appeared as empty space might hide hazards, mechanical anomalies, or something far less tangible. The temperature had dropped subtly, and my fingers grazed the railing for reassurance, yet even tactile sensation felt unreliable. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, and calculated, because the fog's deceptive density could make even a short distance treacherous. As I advanced toward the aft crane, the fog pressed along the deck like liquid, curling around stairwells, support beams, and open hatches. It obscured every reference point, making the same section of metal seem impossibly longer than reality. I leaned over the railing slightly, letting gloved fingers trace edges, testing stability, and feeling the fog swirl unpredictably around posts. The rule's gravity sank in with each step. Misjudging visibility could lead to missteps, disorientation, or worse. Shadows formed within the mist, illusions or not, and I had to maintain an almost obsessive awareness of spacing, edge distance, and airflow. Every careful movement became a negotiation between trust in perception and respect for the fog's deceptive concealment. Near the central deck, the fog thickened abruptly, forming rolling walls of mist that appeared alive, curling along metal surfaces and pooling at intersections. My eyes strained to detect edges of stairs and hatches, and I realized how quickly isolation could magnify uncertainty. Each step required reassessment, recalculation, and adjustment, because one misstep into concealed space could lead to injury or worse. I pressed my palms against the railing, feeling the subtle undulations of metal beneath slick condensation, and forced myself to move in rhythm with observation, not instinct. The fog had a way of concealing both distance and danger simultaneously, and compliance with the rule meant acknowledging its patience and adaptability, accepting that my senses alone could not fully trust the environment. I crouched near a hatch to inspect its seal, aware that fog density could mask even subtle gaps or displacement. The mist swirled tightly around corners, curling into spaces beneath machinery and stairwells, making simple inspection tasks feel perilous. Each shadow could be a misperceived edge or a lurking hazard, and I had to constantly calibrate perception. I ran fingers along metal edges, feeling for warps or inconsistencies, while the fog pressed closer, almost probing, as if measuring attentiveness. The rule's importance became terrifyingly clear. The fog didn't merely obscure, it actively challenged comprehension, forcing heightened vigilance. Even brief lapses in attention could be exploited, and I knew the dense mist demanded respect beyond ordinary caution. Moving toward the starboard storage area, visibility dropped sharply, reducing the deck to mere outlines beneath dense layers of mist. The fog swirled like a living presence, curling along edges of pipes and stairwells, masking depth and distance. I measured each step carefully, using my hands and feet to detect subtle shifts beneath wet metal surfaces, ensuring I didn't misjudge distance or spatial orientation. Shadows created by the fog shifted constantly, and I realized that even familiarity with the deck offered no immunity from its deceptive density. Compliance with Rule 8 required constant recalibration, observation, and patience, because the fog could conceal subtle changes that might otherwise be obvious, turning mundane tasks into hazards. Near the aft railing, the fog thickened yet again, curling around hatches, supports, and stairwells with a seeming deliberation. I crouched slightly to gauge visibility, aware that each swirl and eddy could conceal mechanical irregularities or hidden hazards. Each movement was measured, deliberate, as I used gloves to confirm edges and inspect surfaces beneath the mist. The fog distorted perception, making railings appear closer or farther than reality, and shadows formed false references. Rule 8 reminded me that even familiar areas could become treacherous, and compliance required constant reassessment, cautious motion, and an understanding that density itself could be as threatening as any physical hazard. I advanced toward the central deck, feeling the fog wrap around stairwells and support posts, masking lines and corners with subtle precision. Each footstep was calculated, tested against tactile feedback from railings and grates. The fog seemed almost responsive, curling more tightly around areas where I paused, shifting unpredictably, as though to mislead. I pressed along edges carefully, measuring distance and alignment constantly. The rule wasn't just about visibility. It was about understanding how perception could fail, how the fog's density could deceive senses, and how compliance demanded methodical, deliberate movement. Every step reinforced the importance of acknowledgement, patience, and respect for this deceptive element. On the forward observation deck, the fog thickened even more, curling into vertical walls that reduced visibility to mere meters. I crouched near a hatch, feeling edges, testing alignment, and noting subtle condensation patterns that suggested airflow and density variations. The fog obscured depth perception, creating phantom edges and stairs where none existed. I moved cautiously, maintaining rhythm, testing surfaces with gloved hands, and relying on tactile and visual cues simultaneously. Rule 8 demanded vigilance, focus, and constant reassessment, because the fog's density was both a physical and psychological hazard, capable of concealing danger in ways my senses struggled to interpret. Ignoring it, even briefly, could lead to misjudgment, and I knew the deck required continual attention. Crossing the port side, I noticed how the fog curled differently over warmer metal, pooling thicker around cooler areas, masking structural differences beneath the surface. Each step required careful measurement, subtle adjustments, and attention to the tiniest details. Shadows formed illusions, and edges I thought I could trust vanished into mist. The rule demanded acknowledgement of the fog's deceptive nature, respect for its presence, and cautious movement that accounted for unseen variables. Each observation, each adjustment, each deliberate step became a reinforcement of the principle that the fog could conceal more than any single sense could reveal. Survival depended on recognition, patience, and obedience to this understanding. Near the crane, the mist thickened further, twisting along cables, stairwells, and railings, masking depth and distance entirely. I crouched, testing edges, pressing along hatches and supports, mapping each step with careful attention. The fog's density rendered familiar areas strange, threatening, almost sentient in its obscuration. Rule 8 demanded meticulous observation, awareness of micro-variations, and deliberate, cautious movement. Every shadow, swirl, and curling edge was a potential trap, a test of compliance, patience, and perception. Even now I felt my pulse quicken as the fog pressed closer, a reminder that density alone could conceal more than any hazard I had encountered before. By the time I returned to the middeck, the fog had thinned slightly, but pockets of thick mist remained near stairwells, railings, and hatches. I measured every step, every tactile feedback, and cataloged subtle variations in visibility and airflow. The rule demanded continuous vigilance, because even minor lapses in attention could render familiarity meaningless. Shadows warped, edges seemed to shift, and the fog's deceptive density remained a persistent, almost sentient threat. Compliance with Rule 8 required constant acknowledgement, deliberate steps, and respect for the unseen forces that manipulated perception. Every movement reinforced the lesson that concealment was as dangerous as exposure, and that vigilance was never optional. The first indication that something was off came from the crane control panel, its lights flickering subtly in the thickened fog, and I immediately recalled Rule 9. Never assume equipment is functioning normally when the fog thickens. At first glance, everything seemed operational. The dials glowed, switches remained in position, but a sense of unease pricked at my instincts. The fog pressed close along the deck, curling over pipes and hatches, masking edges and obscuring depth. I pressed my gloved fingers lightly against the panel, feeling a faint vibration beneath the metal that shouldn't have been there. Each flicker and pulse of the machinery felt amplified, and I realized that assumptions could be deadly in this environment. I crouched near the aft engine hatch, running gloved hands along pipes and conduit, while monitoring the panels, noting subtle anomalies in hums, vibrations, and lights. The fog seemed to thicken as I moved, curling in tight spirals around posts and stairwells, distorting perception of space and sound. Rule 9 pressed in my mind, a constant reminder that the machinery could not be trusted to behave predictably. Even small misreads could cascade into larger hazards. I tapped lightly on the metal, listening to echoes and comparing vibrations, calculating the reliability of each observation. Compliance demanded a meticulous balance between observation and caution, acknowledging that visibility and perception were compromised. Moving toward the central deck, I noticed subtle inconsistencies in the lighting along the walkways, irregular flickers that could have been overlooked, if not for the fog. I crouched slightly, tracing wiring conduits, feeling the temperature and subtle vibrations along the metal. Each observation reinforced the lesson embedded in Rule 9. Thick fog distorted perception and reality, making standard indicators unreliable. I tapped the panel repeatedly, noted each response, and adjusted my assumptions accordingly. Machinery that seemed to operate normally could mask hidden malfunctions, amplified by environmental distortion. The fog and my uncertainty created a tension that was physical, mental, and pervasive. As I inspected the forward observation area, the fog swirled aggressively, obscuring railings, posts, and deck edges. The control panel for lighting and environmental systems blinked erratically, seemingly normal but subtly off. My mind raced, recalling Rule 9, forcing me to question every visual and tactile cue. I pressed buttons gently, watched dials closely, and noted slight discrepancies in response times. The fog masked subtle shifts in airflow and temperature, making even routine checks an exercise in skepticism and observation. Every minor reading became a critical data point, a piece of the puzzle in maintaining operational awareness, and the rule demanded that I treat each signal with caution, never trusting appearances alone. Near the starboard crane, the fog thickened further, curling in tight bands that partially obscured machinery and deck edges. I crouched to check the crane's base for alignment, feeling for subtle vibrations that might indicate malfunction. The hum of the rig was irregular, inconsistent with my prior experience, and the rule echoed in my mind. Equipment could not be trusted when the fog warped perception. Each movement required deliberate observation, careful assessment of tactile feedback, and constant cross-referencing against known standards. I tapped lightly, noted responses, and adjusted my interpretation, aware that assuming normal function could be catastrophic in this environment. Crossing toward the aft storage area, I noticed subtle irregularities in the ventilation system, faint but discernible under the thick fog. The mist pressed against pipes and edges, creating illusions of movement and shadow that complicated perception. I pressed my hands along surfaces, tested airflow, and compared readings across multiple instruments. Rule 9 reminded me that assumption was a liability. Only measured, cautious observation could prevent misjudgment. Every minor discrepancy became significant, and the fog amplified both reality and illusion, making the act of checking machinery a careful, deliberate ritual. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders, knowing one error could escalate quickly. Near the lower deck, the fog thickened in swirling columns, curling under hatches, along railings and around stairwells. I crouched, feeling metal edges, running gloved fingers along conduits and machinery to detect subtle inconsistencies. Lights flickered slightly, dials moved irregularly, and I noted vibrations out of sync with expected patterns. Rule 9 demanded skepticism. I had to question each response, each measurement, each reading. The fog's presence intensified uncertainty, making what seemed operational possibly deceptive. I carefully cataloged each anomaly, adjusting assumptions, testing again, and moving slowly, aware that trust in machinery could be fatal. At the central control station, the panels indicated normal readings, yet subtle irregularities suggested otherwise. The fog swirled around my boots and legs, pressing along supports and edges, and every reflection or shadow seemed amplified. I tapped switches lightly, compared dial readings to previous observations, and noted inconsistencies, reaffirming Rule 9's guidance. Even with my focus sharpened, the fog challenged perception, masking subtle vibrations and displacements. Each check became an exercise in patience and diligence, requiring skepticism, observation, and methodical verification. Misinterpretation could cascade into more significant hazards, and I moved with deliberate caution, fully aware of the stakes. Crossing the port side, I felt the fog pressing along the deck, curling around posts, stairwells, and hatches. I crouched, testing machinery and surfaces for irregularities, noting vibrations, temperature differences, and slight hums that were off from the expected baseline. Rule 9 reminded me that the fog could conceal malfunction and exaggerate perception simultaneously. I measured every response, compared readings, and adjusted my assumptions carefully. Each observation was deliberate, each step cautious, each calculation critical. The environment had a subtle intelligence, testing diligence, patience, and compliance with the rule, and I realized that trusting machinery blindly could quickly lead to disaster. Near the aft crane, the fog thickened, pressing along edges, around railings and over stairwells. I crouched to check alignment, feeling vibrations and subtle shifts in metal surfaces. The control panels seemed normal, but inconsistencies persisted, subtle and unsettling. I repeated tests, compared feedback, and noted patterns, conscious that even small oversights could be dangerous. Rule 9 became a mantra: skepticism, observation, verification, patience. Each movement had to account for deception, created by fog density, altered perception, and environmental distortion. Survival required attentiveness, focus, and recognition that assuming normalcy in such conditions was the most dangerous mistake of all. By the time I returned to the central deck, the fog had thinned slightly, but irregularities persisted in machinery, airflow, and vibrations. I continued methodical testing, pressing metal, observing readings, and comparing feedback. Rule 9 remained paramount. The fog could mask subtle failures and distort perception. Each observation reinforced the necessity of skepticism, patience, and methodical verification. Even familiar equipment could betray the inattentive or the unwary. Compliance demanded constant vigilance, careful calibration of perception, and deliberate acknowledgement of all anomalies, no matter how minor, because assuming normal function could be deadly on a fog-engulfed deck. It hit me first as I crossed the central deck, noticing the subtle looping swirls of fog along the railings, and I immediately remembered Rule 10: never attempt to ignore the fog's patterns. they are deliberate. At first glance, they seemed random, harmless spirals curling lazily around posts and hatches. But my instincts screamed otherwise. Each curl, each shift, appeared almost purposeful, a language of movement I wasn't fully deciphering. My boots pressed carefully against wet metal, toes testing traction, while gloved fingers grazed the railings to maintain balance. The patterns weren't static, they shifted with my presence, thickening along edges I approached, receding where I hesitated. Ignoring them, even for a moment, felt like walking blind over razor-sharp uncertainty. As I edged closer to the aft crane, the fog moved in subtle, concentric waves, swirling over stairwells, posts, and machinery in ways that defied natural currents. I crouched slightly to observe, noticing that patterns repeated near certain hatches, almost as if the fog were marking sections or creating invisible barriers. Rule 10 pressed on my mind. Dismissing these shapes as coincidence was dangerous. Each spiral, each curl, held meaning, though I could only grasp fragments. I ran gloved hands along the railings, feeling the fog's movement brush past fingertips, and sensed an intelligence, patient and observant, testing awareness and adherence. Every deliberate pause, every careful motion, became a negotiation with forces unseen, a compliance exercise demanding vigilance. Moving toward the forward observation deck, I noted patterns thickening near corners and edges, curling tightly around metal supports like coils. The fog's movement was mesmerizing and unnerving, creating illusions of depth, stairs and railings where none existed. I pressed my hands along hatches and edges, measuring alignment, depth, and subtle vibrations, constantly adjusting to the fog's shifting design. The rule became immediately tangible. These weren't natural patterns. They were calculated, almost sentient, demanding acknowledgement. Ignoring them could lead to missteps, disorientation, or worse. Each movement required deliberate observation, heightened attention, and careful integration of tactile and visual feedback. Near the starboard railing, the fog twisted in long curling fingers that seemed to wrap around stairwells and hatches with awareness. I crouched low, testing the deck beneath my boots, while observing the swirling eddies that appeared synchronized across multiple areas. Rule 10 demanded compliance. Dismissing the movement as inconsequential was impossible. The fog's patterns could subtly mislead, hiding edges, creating illusions, or signaling potential hazards. Each swirl, each loop, seemed both to anticipate and respond to my presence. Observing, analyzing, and respecting the deliberate design of the fog became an act of survival, a conscious adherence to its invisible rules. Crossing the port side, I noticed how patterns changed subtly as I approached, curling tighter near stairwells, thinning near open panels. My gloved fingers traced edges along railings, hatches, and machinery, feeling subtle vibrations that seemed amplified or diminished, depending on proximity to the fog. The rule's gravity pressed in. Ignoring patterns or assuming randomness could be fatal. Each deliberate swirl, curl, and layer carried meaning, and I had to adjust pace, stance, and observation constantly. The fog's patterns were both warning and guide, an unpredictable map, demanding strict attention to detail, deliberate compliance, and continuous acknowledgement. At the aft storage deck, the fog's movement intensified, curling along posts and stairwells in loops that seemed synchronized with subtle vibrations across the deck. I crouched, hands pressed lightly against railings, testing surfaces and alignment, while my eyes traced the swirling patterns carefully. Rule 10 became increasingly clear. Ignoring these formations, even momentarily, invited misjudgment, error, or exposure to unseen danger. Each eddy, swirl, and twist required recognition, careful analysis, and precise adjustment of movement. Compliance demanded awareness that stretched perception to its limits, blending observation, tactility, and intuition. Near the central crane, the fog formed repeating, overlapping spirals, curling around machinery, railings, and stairwells like an intricate design. I crouched to gauge depth, pressing gloved fingers along metal surfaces to measure vibrations and subtle airflow. The patterns weren't static. They moved in response to my shifts in balance, steps, and proximity. Rule 10 required full attention. Failure to recognize and respect these patterns could mislead perception and create danger. I noted subtle differences in curl width, density, and direction, integrating each into an ongoing mental map of risk. Every step became a deliberate negotiation with the fog, a test of compliance and awareness. By the time I reached the forward observation area, the fog's patterns thickened near stairwells and hatches, curling and overlapping in ways that made familiar structures feel alien. I crouched to inspect surfaces, tracing edges with gloved fingers, while observing the swirling mist. Each pattern seemed purposeful, guiding or deceiving simultaneously. Ignoring them was not an option. Doing so would be to disregard the fundamental principle of Rule 10. Movement required careful pacing, observation, and adaptation to constantly shifting shapes. The fog seemed almost sentient, adjusting its patterns in response to hesitation or misjudgment, a subtle but relentless pressure demanding compliance. Crossing the starboard side, I noticed the fog forming narrow, elongated spirals along the railings and hatches, curling in anticipation of my approach. I pressed my hands against edges, feeling micro vibrations and noting subtle airflow changes that indicated hidden density shifts. Rule 10 was critical here. Dismissing these shapes as meaningless could lead to fatal misjudgment. Each deliberate step, each careful adjustment of pace and posture, was a reaffirmation of obedience to the principle that the fog's patterns were not random. Compliance required constant recalibration of perception, a melding of visual, tactile, and intuitive awareness, and an acceptance that the fog had its own rules. Near the aft railing, the fog thickened into dense, overlapping curls, wrapping along stairwells, hatches, and deck edges. I crouched low, pressing gloved fingers along surfaces, noting subtle temperature and vibration differences, while tracing swirling patterns carefully. Rule 10 demanded attention, analysis, and complete acknowledgement of these deliberate formations. Ignoring them was unthinkable. Every swirl carried meaning, warning, or deception. Movement required integration of all sensory input, methodical attention to detail, and an understanding that each pattern could alter perception. Compliance was survival, observation was protection, and the fog's deliberate shapes dictated cautious navigation. By the time I returned to the central deck, the fog had thinned slightly, but overlapping patterns persisted along railings, hatches, and posts. Each movement required deliberate observation, tactile verification, and mental mapping of swirling patterns. Rule 10 remained critical. Ignoring these formations could render familiar decks alien, treacherous, and dangerous. Every curl, loop, and eddy carried intent, and I navigated accordingly, integrating visual cues, tactile feedback, and intuition into a single awareness. Compliance demanded vigilance, patience, and precise movement, a continuous acknowledgement that the fog's patterns were purposeful, calculated, and potentially lethal if disregarded. It was subtle at first, the way the mist shifted near the starboard railing, curling unnaturally as if aware of my presence, and I immediately remembered Rule 11. Never look directly at the fog when it moves toward you. The edges shimmered in the dim light of the rig, curling in fluid, impossible patterns that my mind couldn't fully process. I forced my eyes to the deck, watching shadows instead, feeling every micro vibration beneath my boots. The fog pressed closer, curling along railings, stairwells, and hatches, and the instinct to look directly at it threatened to override reason. I clenched my jaw, turned my head slightly, and moved with deliberate caution, acutely aware that compliance was the only safeguard against the unknown. Crossing toward the aft crane, the fog swirled and thickened in loops that seemed purposeful, curling around posts and edges in ways that defied natural behavior. My peripheral vision caught subtle movements, almost alive, and I forced myself to remain careful, never locking eyes with the advancing mist. Each step became a negotiation between attention and survival. Shadows elongated, reflections distorted along wet metal, and the fog's motion carried a latent awareness of my presence. Rule 11 wasn't merely caution. It was a necessity to prevent whatever intelligence lingered in the mist from observing me fully. Every careful footfall reinforced the peril of direct gaze. Near the central deck, the fog thickened into dense curtains, swirling along stairwells and posts, shifting in patterns that suggested intent. I crouched slightly to maintain balance, letting peripheral vision guide me while my attention focused on tactile feedback from railings and the deck surface. Subtle temperature changes and micro vibrations hinted at shifts in the fog's movement, and I realized that direct observation could provoke reaction. The rule became an internal rhythm: observe without looking, note without focusing, anticipate without confrontation. Each step required patience, measured pace, and acknowledgement that the fog's approach was deliberate, patient, and aware. Ignoring this principle would be fatal. At the forward observation deck, I noticed the fog pressing against stairwells and hatches with curling, overlapping patterns. I crouched low, pressing hands along edges, and tracing the vibration of metal underfoot, careful to avoid direct eye contact. Each motion of the fog seemed synchronized with subtle creaks and echoes of the rig, creating a disorienting, almost sentient environment. Rule 11 dictated attention without confrontation. To look was to invite consequences that my instincts warned against. I measured each step, each touch, each breath, aware that compliance demanded not only vigilance, but also restraint, a conscious denial of curiosity that my body instinctively craved. Crossing to the starboard side, the fog thickened further, curling along railings, machinery, and posts with an almost deliberate intelligence. I moved slowly, keeping my gaze low, focusing on shadows, reflections, and tactile cues. The deck shifted underfoot as condensation collected in pockets, and the fog's approach distorted depth and perception. Rule 11 was critical. Direct observation amplified danger, and compliance required continuous attention to subtle environmental feedback. I felt the fog respond to hesitation, pause, and movement, a subtle awareness that reinforced the necessity of careful observation without confrontation. Each cautious step reinforced my fragile sense of control amid uncertainty. Near the aft storage area, the fog curled into spirals around stairwells and hatches, moving in slow, deliberate undulations that distorted perception. I crouched, gloved hands pressed along edges, avoiding direct gaze, tracing the slight vibrations and airflow variations. The fog seemed to anticipate movement, reacting to hesitation, pressure, and breath. Rule 11 reminded me that curiosity could be deadly, that the instinct to look could trigger consequences unseen. Each movement required a blend of tactile observation, peripheral vision, and mental mapping, as the fog's deliberate approach demanded compliance and constant, careful attention. At the central crane, the fog pressed along railings and stairwells, curling in overlapping loops that seemed to respond to my pace. I crouched, hands tracing edges, measuring depth, and noting airflow changes while avoiding direct eye contact. Rule 11 became an exercise in patience and restraint. To look was to invite the unknown into direct observation. Every subtle shift, swirl, and curl required attention, interpretation, and adaptation. The fog seemed alive, aware and patient, pressing against edges and patterns that distorted familiar structures. Compliance demanded awareness, caution, and respect for the deliberate movement of the mist. Crossing the port deck, I noticed how the fog thickened near hatches, pooling in dense spirals that obscured depth and edges. I crouched low, measuring distance and vibration through gloves and boots, keeping my gaze indirect. Rule 11 pressed insistently. Direct observation could trigger a response, and obedience was the only safeguard. Each step became a negotiation between survival and perception, observation and restraint. The fog's deliberate movement tested patience, composure, and compliance, amplifying every sound, vibration, and visual cue into a complex system of warnings. Ignoring this principle could unravel orientation, perception, and safety simultaneously. At the forward observation area, the fog thickened yet again, curling into walls and loops that obscured stairwells, railings, and hatches. I crouched, hands pressed along edges, tracing micro vibrations and airflow, careful never to look directly at the approaching mist. Rule 11 demanded compliance, focus, and restraint, an acknowledgement that awareness alone was insufficient. Observation had to be indirect, analytical, patient. Every movement of the fog seemed responsive to hesitation, pressure, and attention, and I adjusted pace, balance, and observation accordingly. The rule was a final bulwark against the unknown intelligence lingering in the mist. Returning toward the central deck, the fog shifted unpredictably, curling, thickening, and twisting along railings, machinery, and stairwells. I crouched, hands tracing edges, feet measuring subtle vibrations, and maintained indirect observation, fully aware that the fog's movement was deliberate. Rule 11 was absolute. To look directly was to risk everything, and survival required patience, perception, and restraint. Each careful, measured movement reinforced the fragile control I maintained over the rig, the fog, and the unknown entity within it. Obedience became instinct, awareness became strategy, and every step was a negotiation with the unseen. Finally, at the aft railing, the fog thickened into dense curtains, swirling in intricate, purposeful patterns that obscured all familiar landmarks. I crouched low, tracing edges with gloved hands, listening to subtle vibrations underfoot, and resisted every instinct to stare directly into the advancing mist. The deck seemed alien, alive, and the fog almost sentient, curling with deliberate intent. Compliance with Rule 11 demanded patience, vigilance, and complete acknowledgement of its subtle intelligence. Every swirl, every curl, every pattern became a guide, a warning, a measure of survival. And then, the fog shifted again, closer, denser, and I froze, aware that observation alone was no longer enough. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.